looks like the remake train is still chugging along. Special mention has to go to the survival horror remakes we've gotten in 2023. 5 years ago, you'd see memes about how all the old horror franchises have died off and only Resident Evil was still around. Now, Capcom's already remade 4 of their old titles. EA put out a Dead Space remake that outclassed a new game made by former Dead Space devs. Alone in the Dark of all things is teasing a remake.
I don't have your stone, and fuck you anyway!
And Konami put out a bunch of press releases for new Silent Hill projects, one of them being a remake of Silent Hill 2 developed by Bloober Team. There's not much love to go around for Konami and Bloober Team. I stopped caring about Konami during the fallout of Metal Gear Solid 5. If the stuff about their treatment of Kojima and other developers are true, then no amount of teasing a Metal Gear Solid remake on next-gen platforms could ever convince me to buy the products again. Maybe not never. As for Bloober Team, I'm not too familiar with their works, but there are videos out there that are heavily critical of their subject matter in their games. G. Henry Perez has a very incisive video about the writing in their last game, The Medium. Long story short, trauma bad, you should feel bad for your trauma, and you should listen to Lord your God to solve all your problems. There's also that thing about how they developed a proprietary way of rendering the same scene twice with different visual effects in real time, and then patented that tech so no one else could use it. And let's not forget, the Jerma clip.
Camera. I think I can type.
Not too many activities.
So, to sum up the dilemma that Konami and Bloober Team face, the company that everyone hates wants a game studio that survival horror fans hate to remake the game that's considered a pillar of the survival horror genre in an environment that not only has high standards for remakes, but especially for remakes of classic horror titles. It's gonna be an uphill battle for them. There were posts circulating on Twitter talking about a potential dodge mechanic in the Silent Hill 2 remake. Some people were already saying that it was Jove or Jawari Dai. Some people were calling those other people out as bandwagoners because there was always a dodge mechanic in the series. It was hard to discern who was bullshitting in that argument, so rather than walking into the Silent Hill remake discourse clueless, I went and finally played Silent Hill 2. If you've always wanted to play Silent Hill 2, but weren't sure how to experience it with the best conditions, look up the Silent Hill 2 Enhanced Edition project. It's made by a team of Silent Hill fans. You still need a copy of the game on the PC, which is out there if you know where to look. But Enhanced Edition is important because it brings the game up to modern resolutions and provides support for X-input controllers. And you don't get the Comic Sans sign for the Silent Hill Ranch. I'm not reviewing the game. It's Silent Hill 2. Anything that could be said about the game most likely has been said, and by much smarter people than me. Instead, I want to make predictions as to how Bloober Team will remake Silent Hill 2. I've got no background in game development, so I'm going about this based on my experiences after playing it for the first time, and comparing the game against how other studios have gone about remaking their own games. Obviously, the closest comparison will be Capcom and their remakes. Since I'll have to cover gameplay and plot points, I'll have to talk about spoilers. But again, it's Silent Hill 2. It's a 20-year-old game, and most people already know what happens due to cultural osmosis. I think the biggest changes will be the game's movement and camera. If you look at Silent Hill 2 purely for its mechanics, it'd be hard to sell it to a modern audience. I'm not saying that the tank controls and cinematic camera angles have aged poorly, but rather, they're not what a studio would want to do if they're hoping to ride the hype of the current remake market. And based on how the trailer for the remake does certain shots, it looks like the game is definitely going to change those parts to cater to a modern audience. Thing is, by placing the camera behind James' back, the remake will risk giving up shots that establish certain moments, like getting the flashlight in the apartments. When James enters this room, the camera is pointed towards James and behind the mannequin holding the flashlight. When James steps forward to pick up the flashlight, the camera cuts to an angle behind James that shows the opposite wall. It's almost like a shot-reverse shot cut you'd see in movies when characters are talking to each other. This shot is important because it not only introduces the flashlight, but the mannequin is wearing clothes that resemble Mary's, and James almost acknowledges that. Also, after James picks up the flashlight, the game introduces the actual mannequin enemy. These types of focus shots happen whenever James approaches an area of interest that'll provide him with a key item, a new weapon, or a puzzle he has to solve to progress. The Resident Evil remakes also lost these camera angles, but what they've done is place prompts on the screen to indicate whether the player can interact with an object if they're within its proximity. If the game wants to direct the player's attention to an event on screen, the camera will automatically move to focus on that event. I can see Bloober adopting these elements because they make it easy for the player to spot the important items in a room, but don't clutter up the screen. Hopefully, they keep that thing James does where he turns his head towards an item he can pick up. I always like that little detail. Another change that might show up is how objectives will appear on screen. The first thing James gets in the game is the town map. As he explores the town and reaches its boundaries, the map updates to reflect those boundaries. If you're playing the game blind, you'll spend the early part of the game wandering around the streets. You might find the trailer that tells you to go to Bar Neely's, which gives you a map that tells you to go to Martin Street to pick up the apartment keys. I expect the remake to flash objective notes on screen to tell the player what to do next. You could argue that it's too handholdy, but it does help to remind the player to return to rooms with puzzles that they have yet to solve or locks that they haven't opened now that they've got the hint or key. More importantly, I think the remake will change the placement of the trailer so that it'll be on the path that leads up to Bar Neely's. I think about how the starting areas of the Resident Evil remakes are linear so as to guide the player as they're learning how to control their character. In Silent Hill 2, the path from the rest area to the cemetery is fairly linear and also serves to help the player acclimate to the game's tank controls and cinematic camera angles. I wouldn't be surprised if the trailer gets placed somewhere along this path to cut down the time it takes to reach the apartments. Bloober will also probably change how exploration will work inside buildings. If you think about the town as an overworld in an RPG, each building you enter operates as its own dungeon. You explore the dungeon to find keys and items that will aid you in your journey while facing threats along the way. At or near the end of each dungeon, you fight a boss. Then the tension is released and you move back into the overworld and off towards the next dungeon. Your first order of business when you enter any building is to find the map. When you check on doors and find out that they're either broken or locked, the map will update the information to remind you the next time you're in that space. The map will also mark areas of interest in case you find a locked chest but still need to find a key. The map has always been one of the best features in the game. Thing is, this type of exploration looks boring if you're playing the game blind, because all you end up doing is running up to each door and checking to see if you can open it. It's not going to sell to a modern audience. An easy fix would be to make every door you can't open look boarded up so that you can instantly see that you weren't getting through without having to stop and check each door. Each building also features puzzles that you have to solve to progress. I don't know how closely Bloober will stick to the original structure in that regard. The Resident Evil remakes have been pretty liberal about reworking their puzzles. Based on what I've seen in the trailer, Silent Hill 2 might also be changing it up. There's a puzzle that spans 2 rooms late in the game. In the first room, there are 6 bodies hanging from nooses. Each body has a piece of paper attached to his face, indicating the crime of which that person was guilty. The next room has the same number of nooses hanging from the ceiling in a poem. The poem describes the story behind each crime, but one of the people executed was actually innocent. You have to figure out which one was innocent and pull on their noose to free them and get the key to progress. The trailer for the remake shows James pulling down a noose in the same fashion, but if you pay attention, you'll notice that there's rain falling down in that scene. The only other place in the game that features a noose is in the courtyard of another building, but you don't ever have to go up there and inspect the noose. Maybe Bloober is consolidating puzzles that share similar elements. What I do think needs reworking are the puzzles involving item combinations. There are puzzles that require a combination of various items, and they feel like they belong in a Sierra adventure game. One puzzle that sticks in my mind is a box in the hospital that needs 2 separate keys, as well as 2 different numerical combinations. If it weren't for the flavor text in some documents indicating that this key card was for the box, I'd probably end up solving the puzzle by brute forcing it and seeing if every item in my inventory worked on it. Same goes for this fish key you find in the hotel. It opens up a suitcase on the 2nd floor, but nothing about the key makes that obvious. The other big change that the remake will bring is definitely the combat. Silent Hill's combat gets described as clunky and awkward, but I think that's a misunderstanding of the game's priorities. Combat is a means to an end in Silent Hill, with that end being to make a space more navigable. You can easily run past enemies when you're outdoors and weave around their attacks when you're indoors, but at some point, James meets up with Maria, and while she's a trooper on lower difficulties, you absolutely need to defend her in certain set pieces to avoid a game over on hard. Boss fights punctuate key points, like just before exiting a building, or when a town shifts into the other world like in the hospital. But there's not much thought required to beating them other than learning how to move around with tank controls, and knowing how to space yourself between the threats so you don't get grabbed. Bloober is definitely going to rework the combat, but the question is, how? They could do what RE4 did and have L1 ready James' equipped melee weapon and L2 ready his equipped gun, but I think that would put too much emphasis on action, and Silent Hill has historically been less about combat than Resident Evil. This is a really cursed thought, and I apologize ahead of time in case they actually do this. but I wouldn't be shocked if Bloober looked at past attempts at Western Silent Hill games, namely Homecoming, to build on a third-person combat system. See how the camera stays close to the player and offsets them to the side? Very much in line with current standards for third-person cameras. The knife combos are a bit much in this example, but if they put more weight on each swing and space out his attacks, I could see it. As for the rumored dodge, I think Homecomings is too aggressive for Silent Hill 2's mood. If I had to look at references, I'd say that weird crouch lunge that Jill does in Resident Evil 3 could work, or that dodge maneuver in Alan Wake, but I don't think James should have a perfect dodge function, because that would again push the game too far into the action territory. I like weapon progression in Silent Hill 2. You start with a plank of wood and get a new weapon in each building, which draws more parallels to RPGs. Right after the apartments, you can upgrade your melee weapon by picking up the lead pipe at the gas station. And once you beat the game, you can always find a chainsaw at the start right before you meet Angela. What I think would be really cool though, is if you could use Angela's knife when she gives it to you, or Eddie's gun after you fight him. Angela's knife is an item you keep in your inventory for the rest of the game, and interacting with it affects which ending you get. But I think a cool twist that the remake could do would be to use the knife as a melee weapon that attacks faster than the plank or the pipe, but each kill from the knife brings you closer to that ending. Same would be true for using Eddie's gun for another ending. After playing through the game repeatedly to see all of the canon endings, my interpretation of the story is that each of the people that the town punishes are getting one of the 3 endings. Angela gets the in water ending, or in her case, in fire, because she gave up on defending herself and wants to be punished, much like how James is implied to go into the water so he could be with Mary in that ending. Reading depressing messages like the patient's diary found on the roof of the hospital, or the letter implying that James might be mad, brings him closer to this ending, which goes hand in hand with giving up and not fighting for your survival. Eddie gets his version of the Maria ending, where he never learns from his mistakes and instead doubles down on his denial. That's reflected in James when Maria starts coughing like Mary did, and he says almost as passionately,
"You'd better do something about that cough."
Assuming James avoids those paths and gets the leave ending, it's supposed to be the easiest one to get on your first try, but I somehow ended up getting Maria when I was recording for this video. That's something I hope that Bloober keeps, getting different endings based on your actions. It's tempting to make it more obvious to the player which path they're headed, but I hope that they show restraint and keep that information away from the player until the very end. Besides those main elements, I hope Bloober brings some quality of life improvements to the little things in the game. Separate the inventory into categories for weapons, key items, and consumables. Silent Hill 3 did that, so I hope that carries over. Allow the player to discard any unwanted items. One of the secret endings requires you to collect 4 unique items before reaching the end of the game, and if you didn't know that, you could inadvertently get that ending when you're aiming for a different one. Being able to toss those items would be a nice feature. Fix James' stamina. This game is notorious for having James panting for breath after doing a bit of light cardio. I really hope I don't have to hear that in the remake. I've been mum over the music and the art direction because they brought on Akira Yamaoka and Masahiro Ito to work on the soundtrack and monster designs, so I think we'll be in good hands there. As for the plot, I know people have reservations on Bloober handling the story based on how the medium turned out, but if Konami actually cares about this project, then I assume they'll be on Bloober's backs to make sure they don't deviate too far from the original plot. We'll just have to wait and see. That's all the things I think we'll see in the remake. Let me know in the comments what gameplay elements you'd want in the remake. Oh, one more thing. I hope Bloober puts the work in to keep all the joke endings and the effort it takes to earn them, especially this one.